In this video, we are looking into GitHub. Let's try to understand what is GitHub, how does it work, everything about GitHub. In the introduction, let's see what is Git, what is GitHub, and how does GitHub works. So let me begin with what is Git and what is GitHub. So, what is Git? Git is a simple tool which we can install on our local machine, which will act as a local repository. We can say that Git is basically a local repository, so we can create a local repositories. We can also create a branches, merge the branches, we can resolve the conflicts, everything we do in our local machines. So, what is GitHub? GitHub is a service which acts as a remote repository where we can store or can have all the repositories globally in a GitHub. We can say that GitHub is an enterprise transforming, startup launching, community driven, super secure, open resource championing, cloud based platform. It makes it simple for the developers to collaborate with one another on open source projects and exchange code files. Developers can pitch their work publicly on GitHub, which also works or functions as a social networking platform. So, it's the largest and most complete development platform in the world that provides hosting for software development and version control. Millions of developers uses it. Every tester or every developer has to push their code into the remote repository. In the remote repository, actual code will be available. So, let's see the process. We will be having Git repository in our local machines. Once we done the task, we commit those changes into local repository and from there we can post the code into remote repository. How it's going to work means, before going to the working process, let's have a glimpse about these terms. Working directory refers to the directory on our local machine where we have cloned a Git repository. Or in simple words, we can say that the working directory is where our current files contained in the repo are. Then the next one is staging, refers to the process of preparing changes for a commit. The staging area, also known as the index acts as an intermediate step where we selectively choose which changes we want to include in our next commit. So the next term is git clone. Git clone is primarily used to point to an existing repo and make a clone or copy of that repo in a new directory at another location. The fourth term is git pull. In GitHub, the git pull command is used to fetch changes from a remote repository and merge them into the current branch of our local repository. Then the next one is git push. In GitHub, the git push command is used to upload local changes to a remote repository. This command is essential for sharing our local commits with others or updating the remote repository with our latest work. So, the last one is local repository. Local repository refers to the copy of a Git repository that resides on our local machine. When we clone a remote repository from GitHub or create a new repository locally, we are essentially setting up a local repository. These are all the terms we need to know for now. Let me explain it and brief it in coming videos, in the next slide. So here you can see the flow chart. Let's go to the working process. Whatever the files we are creating inside the project will be by default available in the working directory. So from there we will add all the files into staging, which is basically a virtual environment. From the staging, we commit all the files into our local repository. This is our local repository. So once the files are committed to our local repository, they are ready to push into the remote repository. This is remote repository. So all the team members will have access on remote repository or a global repository, which is basically GitHub. So in this remote repository, we have three operations. You can see here git clone, git pull, git push. So let's explain it. As you've seen it already, I wanted to explain it again. What is git clone? Imagine in GitHub there is already some repositories available. Somebody is created or some files are available in the remote repository. But we don't have that repository in our local machine. So we want to get that repository in our local machine. For that we can clone that repository. So cloning means the repository which is already available in the remote repository, which we can get in our local machine, that is called git clone. For git clone, we use git clone command. So let's see the git push. How does it work? Suppose I have already some code committed into my local repository, which is git. From there, I want to push entire code into this remote repository. So for that, we can use git push command. So the last one is git pull. What git pull will do is, suppose I have already my local repository, I have already done some changes, but let's say there are new changes in my remote repository and those changes are not a part of my local repository. This can be done using git pull command. Let me give you an example. Let's say there is a developer 1 has created some files and added into the staging and committed those in their local repository. Now the developer 2 on the other side has pushed some code into the local global repository or remote repository, but those changes are not part of my local repository. So in this case we can use git pull command. So it pull all the latest files which are already available in the remote repository into our local repository. This is how the GitHub works, how the directory works, and staging. What is git clone, what is git pull, what is git push. So let me try to give you an example using this images so that you will be clear. Imagine there is a lead He is the lead, and the lead will create a project and ask the team to clone that project in their local machines and ask them to develop their code. So now they do some changes and finally they push the code into this remote repository. But before that, they need to clone the repository which is given by this person into their local machine. Then once they modify or add new files, they need to push their code into the remote repository. Then suppose there are any new changes made by this person in the remote repository. Now, if this team members want that in their local repository to get the changes, they will use full command. This is how the clone, push, and pull works.